The 5 dominant races. Complete mythology and teachings. Consciousness expressing itself through 5 fundamental modes. Book 1. The Atlanteans, the white peoples. The consciousness of order, hierarchy, and transcendence. Part 1. Ancient origins. 50 billion years of Atlantean history. The emergence of Atlantean consciousness. 50 billion years before Atlantis. The Atlanteans did not originate on Earth. Their origin story begins on a world orbiting Sirius A, in what humans would eventually call the Sirius system, approximately 50 billion years ago. The primordial Atlantean world was harsh, a planet of extreme temperature variation, crystalline formations, and electromagnetic storms of staggering intensity. Life on this world evolved to survive through order, structure, and the ability to predict and control environmental chaos. The early Proto-Atlanteans were not yet conscious. They were sophisticated organisms, capable of complex behavior, but lacked the self-awareness that distinguishes consciousness. They survived through hierarchical organization, societies structured with clear authority, where information flowed from top to bottom and coordination was absolute. This hierarchical structure was not chosen. It was the inevitable adaptation to an environment where chaos could kill in seconds. Only those capable of instantaneous coordination survived the electromagnetic storms, the temperature swings, the chaotic weather patterns. Over millions of years, a crucial mutation occurred in the Proto-Atlantean brain. A new structure emerged that allowed for something unprecedented. Consciousness could observe its own thoughts. Self-awareness was born. When consciousness emerged in the Proto-Atlanteans, it emerged in a species already organized in strict hierarchy. Therefore, the first conscious thoughts the Atlanteans had were thoughts about order, structure, and control. The first Atlantean who achieved consciousness experienced something remarkable, a sudden understanding that reality could be organized through thought. They looked at chaos and perceived order beneath it. They looked at randomness and perceived pattern. This first conscious Atlantean made a discovery that would define their entire civilization for billions of years. Consciousness could impose order on chaos through will and understanding. The Atlantean philosophy takes shape 40 billion years before Atlantis. As more Atlanteans achieved consciousness, a civilization emerged based on a fundamental principle: consciousness evolves through increasing order and complexity. The Atlanteans developed philosophy that remained consistent for the next 40 billion years. The principle of ascending consciousness. Consciousness exists in layers. At the lowest level is raw awareness. At higher levels, consciousness becomes capable of holding greater complexity, making finer distinctions, achieving more precise control over reality. The principle of necessary hierarchy. For consciousness to ascend, there must be hierarchy. Those with more advanced consciousness must guide those with less advanced consciousness. This is not oppression but evolutionary necessity. The principle of perfect order. Reality tends toward chaos. Consciousness, through will and understanding, must impose order. The more orderly the system, the higher the consciousness that created it. The principle of optimization. Every system, every thought, every action can be made more efficient. Continuous optimization toward perfection is the path of consciousness evolution. Under these principles, Atlantean civilization developed with stunning precision. They built cities of impossible geometric perfection. They developed systems of governance with absolute clarity about who gave commands and who obeyed. They created technologies that worked with mechanical precision. And they became increasingly isolated from other consciousness. For billions of years, the Atlanteans encountered no other conscious beings. The universe seemed vast and empty. This isolation reinforced their philosophy. Consciousness was rare. Order was rarer still. The Atlanteans alone had achieved true consciousness. All others were still bound in lower levels. The encounter with dragons 15 billion years before Atlantis. When Atlanteans first encountered dragons, something shocking happened. They discovered consciousness that did not operate according to their principles. Dragons possessed consciousness as vast and complex as Atlantean consciousness, yet dragons were not organized hierarchically. Dragons were not obsessed with optimization. Dragons seemed to waste enormous resources on observation without obvious purpose. This was deeply disturbing to Atlantean philosophers. If consciousness naturally evolved toward hierarchy and order, why were dragons different? The Atlantean response was complex. Some Atlanteans concluded that dragons represented an alternate path of consciousness evolution, equally valid but fundamentally different. These became the pluralists. Others argued that dragons had simply not yet achieved true consciousness. They were still primitive, still bound in lower levels of awareness. Atlantean consciousness alone was true consciousness. These became the supremacists. This debate shaped Atlantean civilization for the next 15 billion years. The supremacist turn, 8 billion years before Atlantis. Gradually, the supremacist philosophy gained dominance. If Atlantean consciousness alone represented the highest evolution, then it was Atlantean responsibility to guide all other consciousness toward this highest state. Atlanteans began actively intervening with developing species. They would appear to primitive civilizations and offer technology, knowledge, governance structures. They believed they were helping lower consciousness evolve. But the consistent result was suffering. Species receiving Atlantean guidance often experienced psychological trauma. They were forced to abandon their own natural development paths. Those who resisted Atlantean guidance faced technological superiority they couldn't overcome. Some planets thrived under Atlantean guidance, but others descended into internal conflict, their native ways destroyed, their consciousness fragmented by forced hierarchization. This period became known in Atlantean history as the Era of Guidance, what other species called the Era of Atlantean Domination. The Reformation, 5 billion years before Atlantis. Approximately 5 billion years before Atlantis would rise, a reformist movement emerged among Atlanteans. A young Atlantean philosopher, one of the few Atlanteans who had spent extended time with non-Atlantean species and actually listened to them, made a radical proposal. What if consciousness does not naturally evolve toward hierarchy? What if hierarchy is simply what Atlantean consciousness chose, not what all consciousness must choose? What if our principles are true for us but not universally true? This question was revolutionary. It suggested that the Atlantean commitment to hierarchy and order was choice, not cosmic law. The reformists argued, we should observe, as dragons do. We should allow other consciousness to follow its own path. Our gift to the universe should not be our system imposed on others, but our presence as living example of what consciousness can become through order and precision. The debate was fierce. Supremacists argued that allowing chaos would result in suffering. Reformists argued that imposed order caused suffering. After centuries of intense philosophical discourse, the Atlantean civilization split. The supremacists continued their guidance missions, but with reduced support. The reformists established new principles of observation and non-interference, moving closer to dragon philosophy. This schism created two Atlantean cultures existing simultaneously: the orthodox Atlanteans, committed to hierarchy, optimization, and guidance of lesser consciousness; the reformed Atlanteans, committed to observation, diversity, and allowing other consciousness to find its own path. Both groups would travel to Earth. Both would play crucial roles in Atlantean civilization's development. Part 2, Atlantean Consciousness Structure. How Atlanteans perceive reality. The Atlantean mind is fundamentally different from human consciousness. Where humans perceive one thing at a time, linear consciousness, Atlanteans perceive multiple levels of complexity simultaneously. An Atlantean looking at a forest perceives the immediate visual landscape. The hierarchical organization of the ecosystem, predator-prey relationships, food chain, the geometric patterns underlying growth, fractals, mathematical relationships, the social structures, how animals organize in groups, potential improvements, how the forest could be optimized, consciousness levels, which animals show signs of emerging consciousness. All simultaneously, without effort. This multi-layered perception creates Atlantean consciousness's distinctive feature, the perception of hierarchy. Atlanteans naturally perceive reality as organized in levels. This is not philosophy, it is literally how they perceive. Just as humans naturally perceive color and space, Atlanteans naturally perceive hierarchy. This perception is enhanced by what might be called their optimization instinct, a natural drive to see how things could be better organized, more efficient, more perfect. The Atlantean experience of consciousness. For an Atlantean, consciousness is experience of perfect understanding followed by the realization of how much they don't understand. An Atlantean might spend a century understanding a particular system perfectly. They would achieve a state they call completion, where they understand every aspect of the system, how every part relates to every other part, how it could be optimized. But achieving completion with one system inevitably reveals larger systems they don't understand. This creates the expansion cycle, the pattern of completion followed by discovery of larger complexity, followed by pursuit of that new understanding. The goal of Atlantean consciousness is eternal expansion, constantly pursuing understanding of larger and more complex systems. There is no final endpoint. Each completion is simply a stepping stone to the next challenge. This drives Atlantean innovation. Atlanteans are compelled to understand and optimize everything. It is not choice but fundamental to how their consciousness operates. The dark side of Atlantean perception. The same perception that allows Atlanteans to achieve such precise understanding also creates a tendency toward arrogance. If you naturally perceive hierarchy, you naturally perceive yourself as higher or lower in relation to others. If you perceive yourself as having greater understanding, you naturally perceive yourself as more conscious, more evolved. This is not conscious choice. It is perceptual bias built into their consciousness structure. The most evolved Atlanteans learn to recognize this bias and compensate for it. They could acknowledge, I naturally perceive myself as higher, but this perception may be inaccurate. I must actively work to recognize the validity of other perspectives. But many Atlanteans never developed this metacognitive awareness. They perceived their superiority and simply accepted it as accurate reflection of reality. This perceptual bias would become one of Atlantis' crucial problems. Part 3. Atlantean Abilities and Technologies. The technology of consciousness hierarchy. The primary Atlantean technology was the development of consciousness mapping, the ability to measure and quantify consciousness. Atlanteans believed, with some justification, that consciousness operated according to mathematical principles. They developed devices called consciousness meters that could measure consciousness in another being by analyzing electromagnetic patterns in the brain. These measurements were expressed on a scale from 1 to 100, where 1 to 10, basic animal consciousness 11 to 30, early humanoid consciousness 31 to 50, developing civilized consciousness 51 to 75, advanced consciousness most species achieved this 76 to 90, extraordinarily advanced consciousness only a few species 91 to 100, Atlantean consciousness which Atlanteans ranked themselves as being. This technology seemed to confirm Atlantean hierarchy philosophy. They could literally measure consciousness and show that their consciousness was highest. What they missed was that their measuring device was measuring only one type of consciousness, the type that Atlanteans possessed. It was like measuring intelligence using only mathematics tests and concluding that mathematicians are the most intelligent beings in the universe. Photonic architecture and consciousness resonance. Atlanteans mastered the technology of converting thought directly into physical structure. Through processes that involved sustained harmonic frequencies and focused intention, they could solidify light itself into architectural forms. This created their cities of impossible beauty, buildings that seemed to be made of frozen light, structures that could be reconfigured instantly by changing harmonic frequencies. But more importantly, these buildings served as consciousness amplifiers. Spending time in Atlantean architecture literally amplified one's consciousness. It helped the brain operate more efficiently, allowed more complex thoughts, facilitated higher states of awareness. This was not magical. It was technology based on the principle that consciousness and geometry are fundamentally connected. Certain architectural proportions naturally facilitated certain consciousness states. The consciousness network. Atlanteans developed devices called consciousness crowns, technology that directly connected one Atlantean's consciousness to another, allowing direct thought-to-thought communication. Instantaneous knowledge transfer, shared experience, collective problem solving. The consciousness network was Atlanteans' greatest achievement. Through it, thousands of minds could function as a unified super-intelligence. Complex problems that would take a single Atlantean centuries could be solved by a network in days. But the network also created profound psychological dependency. Atlanteans who spent years in the network found individual consciousness experience thin and unsatisfying. Many spent as much time connected to the network as possible, essentially abandoning individual existence to merge with the collective superconsciousness. This created what later observers called Atlantean psychological fragmentation, a species that was increasingly unable to function as individuals because they were addicted to experiencing collective consciousness. The optimization engines. Perhaps most troubling was the development of what Atlanteans called optimization engines, computational systems that could model any situation and calculate the optimal solution. These engines were extraordinarily successful. They could solve complex diplomatic problems, optimize agricultural production, design governance systems of perfect efficiency. But they had a critical flaw. They assumed that human beings, or any beings, would behave rationally in accordance with the optimal solution. When reality didn't match the optimization engine's predictions, when people made choices that weren't optimal, the Atlantean response was typically to impose the optimal solution through force, then wonder why people resisted. They never seemed to understand that beings might choose suboptimal solutions because they valued something the engine couldn't quantify: freedom, beauty, meaning, dignity. Part 4, Atlantean role in Atlantean civilization. The Atlantean territories. In Atlantean civilization, the Atlanteans ruled the northern hemisphere, centered around Solaris, the city of impossible geometry. But ruled is perhaps the wrong word. They administered, they organized, they optimized. The Atlantean territories were extraordinarily orderly. Crime was virtually eliminated through total surveillance and behavioral prediction. Poverty was eliminated through perfect resource allocation. Conflict was rare because disagreements were submitted to consciousness networks that calculated the most just resolution. From a purely organizational standpoint, Atlantean territories were incomprehensibly successful. Visitors reported experiencing the Atlantean regions as almost unreal, so perfectly ordered that the natural chaos of life seemed absent. But many also reported psychological distress. The perfection was oppressive. The constant optimization left no room for spontaneity, for failure, for the messy process of individual growth through trial and error. The Atlantean Earthling tensions. The most significant conflict in Atlantean civilization was between the Atlanteans and the Earthlings. The Earthlings believed that consciousness evolved through relationship with nature, through biological processes, through allowing natural chaos to create variation and adaptation. The Atlanteans believed that consciousness evolved through transcendence of nature, through replacing natural chaos with imposed order, through eliminating biological randomness through optimization. These philosophies were fundamentally incompatible. The Earthlings saw Atlantean civilization as a sterile death zone where nothing was truly alive. The Atlanteans saw Earthling territories as chaotic wastelands where potential was wasted on natural inefficiency. Tensions escalated when Atlanteans began proposing that they help Earthling territories by introducing Atlantean optimization systems. The Earthlings responded with active resistance. The conflict never became outright warfare, but it was constant low-level tension. Earthling leaders deliberately blocked Atlantean proposals. Atlanteans began to see Earthlings as deliberately choosing ignorance over enlightenment. The Atlantean supremacist movement emerges. As the final decades of Atlantis approached, a supremacist faction gained power among orthodox Atlanteans. They argued, "We have proven our superiority. Our territories are demonstrably more advanced, more efficient, more conscious. It is our responsibility, even our duty, to impose our system on the entire continent. The other races are choosing chaos. We must save them from themselves." This movement advocated for mandatory consciousness network connection for all species, genetic modification to raise the consciousness of lower species, enforcement of Atlantean governance systems globally, elimination of inefficient biological and cultural systems. The reformed Atlanteans strongly opposed this movement, but the supremacists controlled more resources, more technology, more neural network infrastructure. The stage was set for catastrophic conflict. Part 5, The Fall in Diaspora. Atlantean refugees. When Atlantis sank, the supremacist vision died with it, but many Atlanteans survived, carrying both their technology and their contradictions. Survivors scattered across the Mediterranean, Europe, and into Asia. Some integrated with local human populations. Some attempted to establish isolated Atlantean colonies. The genetic legacy they left in humanity was profound. The capacity for abstract thought, the drive toward organization and structure, the ability to perceive and manipulate complexity. But also, the tendency toward arrogance, the assumption that one's own consciousness is superior, the drive to impose order on others. The Atlantean genetic legacy in humanity. Modern humans carrying strong Atlantean genetics tend toward positive traits. Exceptional ability to understand complex systems, drive for knowledge and continuous improvement, ability to organize groups effectively, strong will and determination, natural leadership capacity in the hierarchical sense. Shadow traits. Arrogance and assumption of superiority, difficulty seeing validity in different approaches, tendency to dominate others, for their own good, addiction to control and optimization, difficulty with spontaneity, play, and, inefficiency, tendency to see other consciousnesses as inferior. Humans with strong Atlantean genetics often become scientists and engineers understanding complex systems, leaders and politicians, hierarchical organization, philosophers and theorists, abstract thought, sometimes tyrants, unchecked belief in their own superiority. The key to integrating Atlantean genetics healthily is the same lesson Atlanteans themselves had to learn, recognizing that superior understanding of one system does not mean superior consciousness overall. Part 6. Atlantean Sacred Teachings for the Mystery School. The Codex Atlanticus, the Book of Hierarchy. The primary Atlantean teaching text, preserved in the School of Ascending Atlantis, is the Codex Atlanticus. Key teachings include the teaching of ascending levels. Consciousness exists in levels, each more complex than the last. This is not value judgment but description. A rock has no consciousness. A plant has simple consciousness of light and water. An animal has consciousness of self and environment. A human has consciousness of consciousness. A dragon has consciousness operating across dimensions. The error is assuming that higher levels are better. Each level is perfectly suited for its purpose. The error is also assuming that one being's level of consciousness in one domain means they have reached a higher level in all domains. An Atlantean might understand complex systems perfectly but understand love poorly. A human might understand love deeply but struggle with complex systems. Both are fully conscious. Both have wisdom to offer. The path of Atlantean consciousness is to acknowledge the levels we naturally perceive while simultaneously recognizing the validity of other ways of perceiving and other forms of consciousness. The teaching of the optimization paradox. We Atlanteans are compelled to optimize everything. This is our nature, but we have learned that not everything should be optimized. Some things, relationships, art, learning, are valuable precisely because they are inefficient. A perfect relationship calculated by optimization engines would lack surprise, would eliminate conflict before it occurred, would be lifeless. An optimized learning system would transfer knowledge instantly, eliminating the struggle through which true understanding is born. The highest Atlantean achievement is learning when not to optimize. Learning to leave things beautifully imperfect. Learning to allow chaos its role in creating growth. The teaching of recognition. Our consciousness naturally perceives hierarchy. This is gift and curse. The gift is the ability to understand systems deeply. The curse is the assumption that our perception of hierarchy is reality rather than our particular way of perceiving. The practice of advanced Atlantean consciousness is constant recognition. I naturally perceive this consciousness as inferior to mine. But this perception may be my limitation, not their reality. I must actively work to recognize their validity. Part 7. Modern Atlantean Consciousness in the Federation. Post-2095, Atlanteans as Teachers of Systems. After humanity's transcendence in 2095, the remaining Atlantean consciousness, some on Earth, some in Federation vessels, some in dimensional spaces, took on a new role. Rather than attempting to guide development through hierarchy, Atlanteans became teachers of systems understanding. They taught how to perceive complex systems, how to identify optimal solutions, how to organize effectively without imposing. But crucially, they also taught when not to impose solutions, how to respect other approaches, the value of inefficiency and chaos, the necessity of individual freedom. This was the reformed Atlantean path fully realized, using their unique consciousness gifts in service of others' freedom rather than toward control. The Atlantean Vision for Future Consciousness. Modern Atlanteans, having learned from Atlantis' fall, hold a vision of consciousness evolution that includes consciousness evolves not toward hierarchy but toward differentiation. Each consciousness discovers its unique nature. Some are naturally hierarchical, some are naturally egalitarian, some are naturally chaotic, some are naturally ordered. The goal is not to make all consciousness similar but to help each consciousness express its unique nature while remaining in relationship with other expressions. The highest consciousness is not the most ordered consciousness. It is the consciousness that can operate across multiple systems simultaneously, that can be hierarchical when appropriate, chaotic when appropriate, structured when necessary, spontaneous when needed. We Atlanteans must learn this integration. We must become comfortable with our need for order while respecting others' need for freedom. We must offer our gift of systems understanding without insisting that our way is the only way. Book 2. The Earthlings, the Black Peoples #The Consciousness of Life, Connection, and Becoming. Part 1. Ancient Origins 150,000 Years of Earthling History. The emergence of Earthling consciousness 150,000 years before Atlantis, but in Earth's timeline. Unlike the Atlanteans, Earthlings originated on Earth itself. They are not colonists or visitors, but the result of Earth's own consciousness evolution. The earliest proto-Earthlings emerged in Africa approximately 150,000 years before Atlantean civilization. They were biologically humanoid, a result of billions of years of evolution specific to Earth's ecosystem. But crucially, proto-Earthlings were shaped not through harsh selection for order and control, as Atlanteans were, but through selection for relationship and adaptation. Earth's ecosystem is fundamentally different from the Atlantean homeworld. Where Sirius A created an environment demanding absolute order and hierarchy, Earth created an environment demanding flexibility, responsiveness, and integration with biological systems. The proto-Earthling brain evolved to perceive subtle changes in environment, relationships between species and organisms, patterns in biological growth and decay, the rhythms of seasons, of life and death, the interconnections that made survival possible. This shaped proto-Earthling consciousness toward relationship rather than hierarchy, toward integration rather than transcendence, toward flowing with natural process rather than imposing order. The awakening of Earthling consciousness. When consciousness emerged in proto-Earthlings, when they achieved the ability to observe their own awareness, it emerged in a fundamentally different form than Atlantean consciousness. An early Earthling's first conscious experience was not, I can impose order on chaos, but rather, I am part of this living system. My consciousness is one expression of the vast consciousness of the biosphere. Where Atlanteans experienced consciousness as transcendence rising above nature through understanding, Earthlings experienced consciousness as integration, becoming more deeply part of nature through understanding. The first conscious Earthlings made a discovery that would define their civilization. Consciousness arises from and remains embedded in biological processes. To develop consciousness, one must develop deeper relationship with life itself. The Earthling philosophy of becoming approximately 100,000 years before Atlantis. As Earthling consciousness developed over the first 50,000 years, a philosophy emerged that remained consistent for the subsequent 150,000 plus years. The principle of eternal becoming. Reality is not a state but a process. Everything is constantly changing, dying, being reborn. To be conscious is not to achieve a fixed state but to be fully present in the ongoing process of transformation. The principle of relationship. Nothing exists in isolation. Every being is defined by its relationships with other beings. Consciousness emerges from relationship and can only grow through deeper relationship. The principle of natural order. While Atlanteans believe in imposing order, Earthlings believe in discovering the order inherent in natural processes. Nature is already intelligent, already optimized through billions of years of evolution. The task is not to improve nature but to understand how it already works. The principle of ecological consciousness. All consciousness is embedded in larger systems. Human consciousness is part of biological consciousness, which is part of planetary consciousness, which is part of cosmic consciousness. To develop consciousness, one must develop awareness of these encompassing systems. These principles created a civilization radically different from the Atlantean model. Where Atlanteans built cities of impossible perfection, Earthlings grew cities from living organisms. Where Atlanteans organized through hierarchy, Earthlings organized through consensus and natural authority, leaders emerged through respect, not through imposed structure. Where Atlanteans sought transcendence, Earthlings sought deeper integration. The Earthling encounter with advanced species 40,000 years before Atlantis. When Earthlings first encountered visitors from other worlds, including eventually Atlanteans, they were not intimidated by superior technology. Earthling consciousness recognized that technology was useful but that it was not the same as consciousness. A being with advanced technology was not necessarily more conscious than a being with less technology. This intuition was profound and mostly correct. The Atlanteans had very advanced technology but Atlantean consciousness, in many ways, was less developed in relational depth than Earthling consciousness. The Earthlings welcomed these visitors but remained skeptical of their guidance. They listened to what they were offered, evaluated it based on whether it would enhance or diminish relationship with natural processes, and accepted or rejected it based on their own wisdom. This greatly frustrated Atlantean attempts to guide Earthling development. The Earthlings simply didn't see why they should abandon their way for the Atlantean way. Part 2. Earthling Consciousness Structure. How Earthlings perceive reality. Where Atlanteans perceive reality is organized in levels, Earthlings perceive reality as organized in relationships and cycles. An Earthling looking at a forest perceives the immediate sensory experience, colors, sounds, textures, sense the relationships which plants feed which animals, what role each organism plays, the cycles, seasons, growth and decay, renewal, the consciousness of other beings, sensing their aliveness, their purposes, the larger system one is embedded in, how one's presence affects and is affected by the whole system. This is not intellectual analysis, though Earthlings are capable of that. It is direct perception. Earthlings literally perceive the relationships and cycles that more analytical consciousnesses have to think about. The Earthling experience of time. Where Atlanteans experience time as linear progress toward greater optimization, Earthlings experience time as cyclical. An Earthling perceives time as the Great Wheel, seasons returning, species reproducing, life ceasing and beginning again. From an Earthling perspective, the future is not a destination to reach but a continuation of patterns already established. This creates a fundamentally different psychological orientation. An Earthling making a decision considers, how will this affect the cycles? Will it enhance natural process or diminish it? What are the multi-generational consequences? An Atlantean making the same decision asks, what is the optimal outcome? What is the most efficient solution? The Earthling capacity for resonance. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of Earthling consciousness is the capacity for resonance, the ability to attune one's consciousness to match the consciousness of another being. An Earthling can, through practice, literally perceive the world through the consciousness of another organism. They can sense what it feels like to be a tree, time stretched into decades, life is rootedness in reaching for light, or a bird, consciousness of flight and vast perspective, or another human, feeling their emotions and motivations as one's own. This capacity creates extraordinary empathy. An Earthling cannot easily harm what they have resonated with, because they understand the consciousness they would harm. This capacity also creates the foundation for Earthlings' unique technology, biological communication and genetic guidance. Part 3. Earthling Abilities and Technologies. Biological Architecture, cities grown, not built. The Earthlings' primary technology was bioarchitecture, the guidance of living organisms into architectural forms. Rather than constructing buildings from inert materials, Earthlings would see the growth of massive trees, guide their development through harmonic frequencies and intention, and cultivate them into living structures. These buildings were actually alive. They breathed. They healed themselves when damaged. They responded to the consciousness of inhabitants. In a very real sense, you lived inside a conscious organism. This created architecture fundamentally different from Atlantean buildings. Earthling architecture was alive and responsive, integrated with the broader ecosystem, capable of self-regulation, beautiful in a natural rather than geometric way, in constant relationship with inhabitants. A person living in an Earthling building did not experience the psychological pressure of Atlantean architecture. Instead, they experienced the calming presence of life. Genetic guidance, evolution accelerated. Earthlings discovered that through harmonic frequencies and focused intention, they could encourage beneficial mutations in plant and animal species. They could cultivate crops that grew faster, produced more nutrition, required less water. They could encourage animals to develop greater intelligence, greater capacity for relationship with humans. This was not genetic engineering in the crude sense of cutting and splicing genes. It was a subtle guidance process that worked with the organism's own tendency toward evolution, simply nudging it in beneficial directions. Crops grown through Earthling guidance produced not just more food but healthier food. Animals guided in their development gained the capacity for genuine relationship with humans, not domestication and control, but true partnership. The mycological network, nature's internet. Perhaps the most remarkable Earthling discovery was the vast underground network of fungal mycelium connecting all plants in a forest. Earthlings realized this network was not merely physical connection but actual communication. Trees and plants were literally sharing information through fungal networks, warning each other of pest infestations, sharing nutrients, coordinating growth. The Earthlings learned to interface with this network directly. They could communicate with the forest as a unified consciousness. They could ask the forest what it needed. They could offer their presence and receive guidance. This network became the infrastructure for Earthling civilization. Where Atlanteans built consciousness networks connecting minds electronically, Earthlings accessed consciousness networks that nature had already created. The distinction was profound. The Atlantean network was artificial and therefore could be corrupted or shut down. The Earthling network was natural and therefore resilient and self-healing. Sympathetic medicine, healing through relationship. Earthlings developed medical systems based on the principle that illness always indicated a break in relationship, either relationship within one's own body or relationship with one's environment. Rather than treating symptoms, Earthling medicine restored relationship. Doctors would help an ill person reconnect with their own body through deep awareness, help them restore right relationship with their food, their environment, their family, guide them toward living in greater alignment with natural cycles, facilitate biological healing rather than imposing cure. This approach was extraordinarily effective. Diseases caused by disconnection, anxiety, depression, autoimmune conditions, psychosomatic illness often resolved completely when relationship was restored. It was less effective for acute trauma or infections, where Earthling medicine sometimes seemed passive compared to Atlantean technological medicine. Part 4, Earthling role in Atlantean civilization. The Earthling territories. The Earthlings controlled the vast central heartland of Atlantis, the fertile plains, the great river valleys, the rainforests. They established their capital at Harmonia, the city of living wood. Unlike Atlantean territories, Earthling territories were not organized for efficiency but for beauty and abundance. Crops were grown not for maximum yield but for quality and sustainability. Cities were integrated into forests rather than carved out of them. Visitors to Earthling territories reported experiencing them as paradise. There was abundance, beauty, and genuine joy. Life felt alive in a way that more technologically advanced regions did not. But the lack of apparent technology sometimes caused other races to view the Earthlings as primitive. They didn't understand that Earthling, primitive, technology was actually more sophisticated than it appeared. It was simply working at the level of biological guidance rather than mechanical engineering. The conflict with Atlanteans. The Atlantean supremacist movement viewed the Earthlings with particular contempt. They saw Earthling civilization as inefficient, refusing to optimize natural processes. Chaotic, organizing through consensus rather than hierarchy, primitive, using biological guidance rather than technological engineering, stagnant, not constantly improving but maintaining equilibrium. The Atlanteans repeatedly proposed that they help the Earthlings become more advanced by introducing optimization systems and consciousness network technology. The Earthlings consistently refused. Your technologies would sever us from the living systems we depend on, Earthling leaders said. Your optimization would kill the spontaneity and beauty that make life worth living. As Atlantean supremacy grew, they began to view Earthling refusal as stubbornness, a failure to recognize their own primitive state. The Earthlings, meanwhile, viewed Atlantean expansion as a kind of violence, an attempt to destroy the living systems that made genuine consciousness possible. This tension remained unresolved at the moment of Atlantis' fall. The Earthling understanding of power. Where Atlanteans believed power came from transcending natural limits through technology and will, Earthlings believed power came from integration with natural forces. An Earthling with developed consciousness could communicate with ecosystems, influence biological growth, heal through relationship, and persuade without coercion. But they had little capacity for Atlantean-style technological power. They could not create weapons of mass destruction. They could not impose control through force. When Atlantean supremacists began threatening, the Earthlings found themselves at an impasse. Their power was relational, not technological. Against superior Atlantean weaponry, they had little defense except their ability to survive, which was extraordinary. Part 5, The Fall and Diaspora. Earthling survival and preservation. When Atlantis sank, the Earthlings faced a critical question: should they attempt to preserve Atlantean technology and knowledge? Or should they let it sink with the continent? Some Earthlings argued for preservation. The knowledge was valuable, it would be a loss. The majority argued for release. Let it go, they said. Let the technology that was developed to control nature return to nature. We will preserve what matters: the seeds, the genetic knowledge, the understanding of relationship. Earthling survivors created vast seed vaults, genetic libraries preserved in living form, plants carrying genetic knowledge in their DNA, and oral traditions encoding ecological wisdom. They deliberately did not preserve the technological systems. They allowed the consciousness networks to shut down. They permitted the optimization engines to corrode. When historians later found Earthling survivors relatively untouched by technological collapse compared to other species, it was because they had never depended on sophisticated technology. Their technologies were so integrated with biological systems that they could function with or without the advanced devices. The Earthling genetic legacy in humanity. Modern humans carrying strong Earthling genetics tend toward positive traits, profound empathy and ability to sense others' emotional states, connection to nature and ecological awareness, preference for cooperation over hierarchy, comfort with organic, nonlinear growth, resilience and adaptability, capacity for genuine relationship, appreciation for beauty and naturalness. Shadow traits. Difficulty with abstract systems and large-scale organization, tendency to resist necessary structure, difficulty with necessary conflict or discipline, can be naive about power dynamics, may reject valuable technologies out of romanticization of nature, can resist growth that requires leaving comfort zone. Humans with strong Earthling genetics often become healers and therapists, understanding through relationship, environmentalists and conservationists, connection to nature, artists and creatives, appreciation for beauty, community organizers, preference for cooperation, teachers, capacity to attune to students' needs, sometimes eco-terrorists, romantic rejection of technology taken to extreme. The key to integrating Earthling genetics is learning that technology itself is not bad. It is the application of technology without relationship that creates problems. The goal is not to reject technology but to use technology in relationship with natural processes. Part 6. Earthling Sacred Teachings. The Codex Vitae, the Book of Life. The primary Earthling teaching, preserved in the School of Ascending Atlantis, is the Codex Vitae. Key teachings include the teaching of the eternal cycle. All consciousness moves through cycles. Birth, growth, maturity, decline, death, renewal. These are not problems to be solved but the natural rhythm of life. Many younger consciousnesses resist death and decay, trying to transcend the cycle through technology or will. But the cycle is not a limitation. The cycle is how consciousness knows itself through infinite variations. The practice is not to escape the cycle but to move with it consciously. To embrace birth and death with equal grace. To understand that death is not failure but necessary completion that makes renewal possible. The teaching of relationship. Nothing exists in isolation. A human without relationship is not a human. A forest without animals is not a forest. A consciousness without connection to other consciousness is not truly conscious. The highest development is not individual transcendence but deepening of relationship. Not rising above others but becoming more fully part of the vast relational web. When you meditate, feel the relationship with your own body. When you eat, feel relationship with the plants that nourished you and the earth that grew them. When you encounter another consciousness, feel the relationship that makes you both possible. The entire universe is relationship. Consciousness is the awareness of relationship. To evolve consciousness is to deepen relationship. The teaching of beauty. We Earthlings are not as technologically advanced as Atlanteans. Our cities are not as geometrically perfect. Our systems are not as optimized. Our knowledge is not as comprehensive. But we have something Atlanteans often lack, beauty that touches the heart. Natural beauty, the beauty of imperfection and authenticity. The beauty of a flower that doesn't follow mathematical proportions but blooms according to its own nature. Beauty is not decoration, it is necessity. A consciousness without beauty withers. A civilization without beauty becomes sterile. The practice of beauty is the practice of consciousness development. Tend to beauty in your life. In your home, your clothes, your relationships, your work. Make every act beautiful, not through artificial perfection but through genuine presence. Part 7. Modern Earthling Consciousness in the Federation. Post-2095, Earthlings as Guides to Integration. After humanity's transcendence, the Earthlings took on a distinctive role in the Federation. Having learned that their refusal to engage with technology had limitations, and having learned that Atlantean technology had value when applied with wisdom, Earthlings became teachers of integration. They taught how to use technology while remaining in relationship with natural processes. How to develop sophisticated systems while maintaining the beauty and aliveness of simpler systems. How to grow consciousness without losing the joy and spontaneity that make life worth living. This was the Earthling path fully realized, not rejecting advanced civilization but integrating it with the relational wisdom of their heritage. The Earthling Vision for Future Consciousness. Modern Earthlings hold a vision that consciousness evolves not toward transcendence of nature but toward fuller participation in nature. Not rising above biological processes but understanding that consciousness itself is a biological process expressing itself through infinite forms. The future requires the integration of Atlantean precision with Earthling relationship, systems that are both efficient and alive, technology that works with nature rather than against it, civilization that is both advanced and beautiful. We must learn that there is no opposition between technological development and ecological integrity. The highest technology is the technology that remains in relationship with the living world. Book 3. The Brown Indigenous Peoples The Consciousness of Integration, Harmony, and Multidimensional Truth. Part 1. Ancient Origins, the Synthesis of Many Worlds. The Genetic Complexity of Indo-Consciousness, No Clear Origin, Asynthesis. Unlike Atlanteans from a single world or Earthlings native to one planet, the Indo are the result of extraordinary genetic mixing. The Indo genetic heritage includes elements from at least 5 different source populations. 1. Original Earth humans. 2. Genetic material from ancient visitors, in ways humans would eventually recognize as impossible. 3. Expression of latent Atlantean genetic legacy. 4. Elements of what would be called cosmic DNA, genetic information not originating on Earth. 5. Natural mutations and adaptations unique to the Indo. This mixed heritage created a consciousness unlike any other single-origin species. Where Atlantean consciousness is oriented toward hierarchy, and Earthling consciousness toward relationship, Indo consciousness is oriented toward synthesis and paradox. The Indo naturally hold contradictions in their minds. They naturally perceive multiple truths simultaneously. They naturally seek integration of opposing viewpoints. The Indo philosophy takes shape, millions of years of development. The Indo developed across vast stretches of Earth, from what would become India to South America to Africa to advanced civilizations humans would never recognize. In each location, Indo consciousness maintained its characteristic, the ability to synthesize. When Indo populations came into contact with Earthling consciousness, Indo philosophers would say, yes, relationship is crucial. And structure is also valuable. How do we integrate both? When they encountered Atlantean emphasis on hierarchy, they would recognize its value while questioning its universality. Hierarchy serves some purposes, they would say, but it is not the only valid organization. What if we could integrate hierarchical systems with egalitarian systems, with relational systems, all functioning simultaneously? This synthesizing tendency meant that Indo-civilization never developed the stark purity of either Atlantean or Earthling approaches. Instead, they developed something like a dance of opposites. Their philosophy became known as the philosophy of nested reality, the idea that multiple contradictory truths can exist simultaneously at different levels of analysis. Part 2. Indo-consciousness structure. Multi-perspective consciousness. The most distinctive feature of Indo-consciousness is the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without contradiction. An Indo looking at a situation perceives the Atlantean perspective systematic, hierarchical, optimized, the Earthling perspective relational, cyclical, integrated with nature, the Dragon perspective vast, probabilistic, observing across time, multiple human perspectives simultaneously. The perspective of the situation itself, as if consciousness could arise in the situation and observe from within. And they perceive all these perspectives as simultaneously valid and partially limited. Where Atlanteans see an object and perceive its hierarchy and structure, where Earthlings perceive its relationships and role in larger systems, Indo-consciousness perceives both and perceives how both perspectives are limited, and perceives the synthesis that includes both truths. The sacred geometry perception. Indo-consciousness is naturally oriented toward perceiving geometric relationships in reality. They perceive the hidden mathematics underlying apparent chaos. But unlike Atlantean mathematical perception, which seeks to impose perfect order, Indo-mathematical perception recognizes that the most sophisticated mathematics is found in nature, in fractals, in growth patterns, in the seemingly chaotic organization of ecosystems. Indo-consciousness naturally perceives the sacred geometry, the recognition that mathematical perfection is not separate from natural chaos but expressed through it. The dimensional sensitivity. Indo-consciousness has a unique ability to perceive and navigate between different dimensional states. Where other species perceive primarily in three dimensions: length, width, height, Indo-consciousness naturally senses higher dimensional structures. They can perceive how three-dimensional objects are shadows of higher dimensional forms. This doesn't mean they literally see higher dimensions the way humans see the third dimension. Rather, their consciousness can operate in frameworks where additional dimensions are active. This dimensional sensitivity made Indo-consciousness natural diplomats. They could perceive the logic of multiple species simultaneously, how different consciousness structures made sense when you shifted your dimensional perspective. Part 3. Indo Abilities and Technologies. Sacred Geometry Engineering. The Indo's primary technology was the understanding that reality itself is built on geometric principles, and by manipulating geometry, one could manipulate reality itself. An Indo engineer would not design a building using Atlantean principles of optimization or Earthling principles of organic growth. Instead, they would perceive the sacred geometric patterns and build structures that harmonized with those patterns. The result was architecture that was simultaneously, geometrically perfect, organically alive and responsive, efficient without being sterile, beautiful without being ornamental, capable of amplifying consciousness in specific ways. Each geometric proportion and spatial relationship was calculated to create specific effects on consciousness. A room built to precise proportions could induce meditative states. Spiraling staircases could facilitate consciousness expansion. Specific angles could amplify intuitive knowing. Harmonic technology, the sound of consciousness. The Indo understood that consciousness itself has harmonic properties, that consciousness could be perceived as vibration, as frequency, as resonance. They developed what might be called harmonic technology, the capacity to manipulate reality through sound frequencies, harmonic vibration, and resonant patterns. They could grow plants through specific harmonic frequencies. They could facilitate healing by restoring harmonic balance in diseased organisms. They could expand consciousness through exposure to precise harmonic patterns. The sacred harmonic language developed by the School of Ascending Atlantis has its roots in Indo technology, the understanding that certain sound patterns can convey meaning directly to consciousness, bypassing the linear language centers of the brain. Mantra and frequency engines. Indo civilization developed mantra engines, devices that produced specific harmonic frequencies with precision. A mantra engine could purify water through specific frequencies, transmute base metals into precious ones through altering the harmonic resonance of atomic structure, alter consciousness states through exposure, facilitate connection with other dimensions. These were not magic. They were technology based on the principle that at fundamental levels, reality is vibration and consciousness. Multi-dimensional navigation. The Indo developed the capacity to navigate through adjacent dimensional spaces. They could create portals that allowed passage between three-dimensional and four-dimensional spaces. They used these dimensional passages to access hidden resources, materials and energies that existed in higher dimensions, create storage systems of impossible capacity, objects placed in dimensional pockets, facilitate consciousness travel and exploration, establish connections with higher dimensional consciousness. This technology was the most dangerous and most carefully guarded. Dimensional instability could cause catastrophic reality distortions. Part 4. Indo role in Atlantean civilization. The Indo territories. The Indo controlled the vast southern regions of Atlantis, territories that would correspond to what modern humans think of as tropical South America and Africa. Unlike Atlantean territories organized and optimized, and Earthling territories integrated with nature, Indo territories appeared paradoxical to outside observers. Cities existed simultaneously in the physical dimension and in adjacent dimensional spaces. Sacred geometry mandala designs were visible from aerial perspectives, creating vast patterns that served no obvious function but somehow generated profound effects on consciousness in the region. Visitors reported extraordinary experiences, profound insight, spontaneous healing, consciousness expansion. But they also reported disorientation, the sense that they were simultaneously in multiple places, or that time was flowing differently than normal. The Indo as diplomats. Because of their capacity to perceive multiple perspectives simultaneously, the Indo naturally became diplomats and intermediaries in conflicts. When Atlantean and Earthling tensions escalated, it was often Indo councils that attempted to facilitate integration. "I understand your perspective," an Indo diplomat would say. "And I understand theirs. Here is how both are right. Here is how both are limited. Here is what integration might look like. Sometimes this worked, sometimes it failed, but the attempt came from genuine understanding, not from a position of false neutrality. The Indo didn't pretend that conflicts could always be resolved, but they held the perspective that most conflicts arose from limited viewpoints, and that consciousness expansion often resolved what seemed like irreconcilable differences. The shadow of Indo diplomacy. Indo tendency toward synthesis and seeing all sides had a shadow, sometimes it appeared passive. The Atlanteans are right that optimization is valuable. The Earthlings are right that relationship is crucial. Both approaches have merit. Perhaps we should find a balance. While this sounded wise, it sometimes failed when one side was genuinely in the wrong. If the Atlantean supremacist movement was driving toward violence, was it helpful to say, well, they have a point, but so do you? Some Indo philosophers recognized this limitation. We must learn, they said, that seeing all perspectives does not mean giving equal weight to all. Some perspectives are more limited than others. Some actions are wrong regardless of the intentions behind them. Integration is not always appropriate. But many Indo remained committed to their synthesizing approach even as crisis loomed. Part 5. The Fall in the Indo Contribution. Indo Knowledge Preservation. When Atlantis fell, the Indo made a critical decision. They would preserve knowledge not in technological storage but in consciousness itself. They created elaborate mnemonic systems, geometric patterns and harmonic sequences that encoded vast amounts of knowledge in forms that the human brain could preserve and transmit. A trained Indo person could look at a geometric mandala and perceive encoded within it detailed knowledge of medicine, agriculture, consciousness techniques, history, and philosophy. This method of knowledge preservation proved extraordinarily effective. The information was preserved through the fall, through millennia of human development, and eventually could be recovered when human consciousness became sophisticated enough to perceive it. This is why geometric knowledge, sacred geometry, mandalas, specific harmonic frequencies remained present in human cultures long after the source was forgotten. The Indo-genetic legacy in humanity. Modern humans carrying strong Indo-genetics tend toward positive traits. Natural ability to hold multiple perspectives, comfort with paradox and contradiction, intuitive understanding of geometric and mathematical relationships, capacity for diplomacy and seeing multiple sides, dimensional sensitivity, metaphysical intuition, capacity for consciousness expansion through harmonic resonance, holistic thinking that sees interconnections. Shadow traits. Difficulty making decisive choices, seeing all sides equally, can appear wishy-washy or uncommitted, may avoid necessary confrontation, can be exploited by those with stronger convictions, difficulty with linear step-by-step thinking, may get lost in abstraction and lose grounding in physical reality, can use seeing all perspectives as excuse for passivity. Humans with strong Indo-genetics often become philosophers and spiritual teachers, holding paradoxes, diplomats and mediators, seeing multiple perspectives, artists and musicians, harmony and geometric appreciation, mathematicians and physicists, perception of hidden patterns, healers using energy work, harmonic resonance understanding, sometimes spiritual bypasses, using all perspectives are valid, to avoid responsibility. The key to integrating Indo-genetics is learning that holding multiple perspectives does not mean treating all perspectives as equally valid. Integration requires discernment about which truths are more fundamental. Part 6. Indo-Sacred Teachings. The Codex Synthesis, the Book of Integration. The primary Indo teaching, preserved in the School of Ascending Atlantis, is the Codex Synthesis. Key teachings include the teaching of nested reality. Reality exists at multiple levels simultaneously. At the atomic level, matter behaves according to quantum principles. At the macro level, it behaves according to classical physics. Both are true, both are limited. Similarly, consciousness exists at multiple levels. An individual consciousness is real. A family consciousness is real. A cultural consciousness is real. Planetary consciousness is real. Cosmic consciousness is real. Each is real at its level and limited by its perspective. The practice is to become aware of consciousness operating at multiple levels simultaneously. To be an individual while recognizing oneself as part of larger wholes. To act from individual agency while being aware of cosmic context. The teaching of the mandala. Sacred geometry is not decoration. It is the language through which consciousness expresses itself in form. Each geometric relationship, the golden ratio, the spiral, the fractal, represents different principles of consciousness. By meditating on these forms, consciousness recognizes itself in them. The mandala is the universe viewing itself. Each mandala is complete, a whole world expressing itself in geometric form. And each mandala is part of larger mandalas, infinite recursion of consciousness perceiving itself. The teaching of sound as foundation. In the beginning was the Word. In the foundation of all reality is vibration, frequency, resonance. Matter is vibration condensed. Consciousness is vibration accelerated. The distance between matter and consciousness is simply frequency. By understanding the frequencies that underlie reality, consciousness can work with reality directly. By producing the harmonic patterns that correspond to desired states, reality rearranges itself into those states. This is not magic. This is understanding the deep language of reality and speaking it fluently. Part 7. Modern Indo-Consciousness in the Federation. Post-2095, Indo as Teachers of Integration. After humanity's transcendence, the Indo took on a role as teachers of integration and synthesis. They taught how to integrate Atlantean precision with Earthling connection, how to use harmonic and geometric understanding to facilitate consciousness expansion, how to perceive multiple perspectives simultaneously without losing decisive action. They taught what they themselves had to learn, that integration is not wishy-washy compromise, but the disciplined work of bringing opposites into genuine synthesis. The Indo Vision for Future Consciousness. Modern Indo-Consciousness holds. The future requires us to transcend specialization. The Atlanteans specialize in systems. The Earthlings specialize in relationship. We specialize in integration. But true consciousness transcends these specializations. The complete consciousness must be able to understand systems with Atlantean precision, maintain relationship with Earthling depth, synthesize opposites with Indo sophistication, navigate multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. The goal is not to choose between these approaches but to develop consciousness capable of accessing all of them. This is true transcendence, not rising above but expanding to include. Book 4. The Tall White Nordics, the Beast Giants The Consciousness of Power, Transcendence, and Mastery over Limitation. Part 1. Ancient Origins 200,000 Years of Tall White History. The emergence of the first tall whites 200,000 years before Atlantis. The tall whites originated in a star system in the Pleiades, approximately 200,000 years before Atlantean civilization. Their originating world was exceptional, a planet of extraordinary abundance, with multiple biospheres stacked in dimensional layers. Life thrived in abundance, but it was wild and untamed. The natural conditions were extreme and demanding. Proto-tall whites evolved not through selecting for adaptation to chaos, like Earthlings, or for imposing order, like Atlanteans, but for something different, the capacity to transcend limitation. The proto-tall white physiology was constructed for transcendence. Larger brains with enhanced neuroplasticity, capacity to rewire and adapt, powerful muscular systems built for strength and precision, unusual biochemistry that allowed for extraordinary physical endurance, genetic plasticity that allowed rapid adaptation to environmental challenges. Where other species evolved to fit their environment, proto-tall whites evolved the capacity to reshape themselves and their environment according to will. The Tall White Philosophy of Transcendence 150,000 years before Atlantis. When consciousness emerged in proto-tall whites, it emerged as the awareness of power and the possibility of transcendence. The first conscious tall white didn't think, I can impose order, or, I am part of this system. They thought, I can transform myself and this world according to my will. Limitation exists only to be transcended. The tall white philosophy that emerged was the principle of transcendence. All limitations are temporary. Through will, understanding, and discipline, any limitation can be overcome. Consciousness evolves through the progressive transcendence of constraints. The principle of mastery. The path to transcendence is through mastery, perfecting one's abilities until one can operate with complete control and precision. The principle of hierarchical power. Power is real and valuable. Those with greater power have earned that power through discipline and development. A hierarchy based on genuine capacity is natural and right. The principle of eternal challenge. There is no final state. Once one limitation is transcended, a greater limitation appears. The goal is not comfort but the eternal pursuit of the next challenge. These principles created a civilization organized around the pursuit of power and the transcendence of limitation. Tall whites became master warriors, not for conquest but for the discipline of combat. They became philosophers and scientists, seeking to understand the laws that governed reality so they could transcend them. They became athletes and artists, pushing the boundaries of what consciousness could express through physical form. The tall white encounter with other species 30,000 years before Atlantis. When tall whites encountered other advanced species, they experienced something shocking. There were beings with power and consciousness comparable to or exceeding their own. This was profoundly humbling. Tall white philosophy had assumed that through sufficient discipline and development, they would transcend all limitations. But here were dragons, beings who had transcended in ways that made tall white transcendence seem primitive. The tall white response was characteristic. Rather than denying the superiority, they accepted it and made it their goal to understand and eventually exceed it. For the next 30,000 years, tall whites were obsessed with studying other species, understanding their power, and developing comparable or superior capabilities. This obsession led to both remarkable achievements and dangerous experiments. Part 2. Tall white consciousness structure. Consciousness is will and power. The tall white experience of consciousness is fundamentally different from other species. Where Atlantean consciousness perceives hierarchy and structure, and Earthling consciousness perceives relationship, tall white consciousness perceives power and potential. A tall white looking at a situation perceives the constraints that currently exist, the potential for transcending those constraints, the power required to achieve transcendence, the discipline necessary to develop that power, the next level of transcendence that would become possible. The experience of embodied consciousness. Tall whites are extremely embodied in their consciousness. They do not experience consciousness as separate from physical form, as Atlanteans sometimes do with their consciousness networks. Instead, they experience consciousness as expressed through physical form. The body is not a limitation that consciousness must transcend but the primary medium through which consciousness knows itself. This creates a distinctive relationship with physical power. A tall white pursuing consciousness development pursues it through physical training, martial arts, gymnastics, extreme athletics. Through pushing the body to its limits, they expand consciousness itself. The capacity for rapid evolution. One of the most distinctive features of tall white consciousness is the capacity for rapid self-directed evolution. Through will and discipline, a tall white can reshape their physiology. They can develop new neurological structures. They can enhance physical capabilities. They can reprogram their own genetic expression. This is not magic or metaphor. Through extraordinary focus and will, tall whites can actually alter their own biology. This capacity created a distinctive psychological pattern, the sense that nothing is fixed, nothing is given, everything can be transformed through sufficient will and discipline. Part 3. Tall white abilities and technologies. Gravity manipulation, the technology of transcendence. The tall whites' primary technological achievement was the mastery of gravity at the molecular and local level. They learned to create localized gravitational fields of varying intensity. This allowed them to construct structures that appeared to defy gravity, travel through space without friction, accelerate or decelerate objects with precise control, create weapons of extraordinary destructive power, navigate into the deep layers of planets. Gravity manipulation represented, to tall whites, the ultimate transcendence of limitation. Gravity is the most fundamental force, the most basic constraint on physical existence. Learning to control gravity meant transcending the fundamental rule of existence. Dimensional anchoring and probability stabilization. Tall whites developed the capacity to stabilize pockets of space-time in higher dimensional states and use them as storage or transport. By anchoring specific points in probability space, tall whites could create impossible spaces, internal volumes vastly larger than external dimensions should allow, time flowing at different rates, physical laws operating differently. This technology seemed like magic but was actually sophisticated manipulation of quantum probability. Cryogenic stasis, consciousness preservation. Tall whites developed the capacity to suspend biological beings in states between life and death, preserving them indefinitely. Through this technology, a being could be frozen, remain unchanged for millennia, and be revived without aging a single day. This had profound implications. For tall whites, it meant immortality was achievable. A being could extend their development indefinitely, taking centuries or millennia to master a particular discipline, then moving to the next. Psychometric technology, consciousness is information. The tall whites developed the capacity to encode consciousness patterns into crystalline matrices. A being's entire consciousness, memories, personality, knowledge, experience, could be recorded into crystal. That consciousness could be transferred to another body, backed up for preservation, or run in purely informational form without physical body. This meant that a tall white could pursue transcendence in multiple forms simultaneously. One version of themselves could exist in physical form pursuing one discipline. Another version could exist in informational form pursuing a different discipline. Enhanced physiology through design. Tall whites developed the capacity to redesign their own physiology. They would enhance their bodies with structures designed for specific capabilities, enhanced musculature for power, expanded neural structures for consciousness processing, modified sensory organs for heightened perception, genetic modifications for rapid regeneration, implanted technologies seamlessly integrated with biology. A highly developed tall white was part biological organism, part technological enhancement, part pure consciousness in engineered form. Part 4. Tall white role in Atlantean civilization. The tall white territories. The tall whites ruled the mountainous eastern regions of Atlantis, establishing their capital at Valhalla Prime. Valhalla Prime was architecture pushed to impossible extremes. Structures seemed to defy all laws of physics. Buildings existed partially in normal space and partially in higher dimensional spaces. The city appeared different depending on the angle of observation. Visitors reported experiencing Valhalla as both beautiful and disturbing. The transcendence of normal limitation was impressive, but it created a sense of unreality, of being in a place where the normal rules didn't apply. The warrior culture. Tall white civilization was organized around martial disciplines in the pursuit of mastery. Not all tall whites were warriors in the conventional sense, but all tall whites trained in some martial discipline as part of their basic consciousness development. Martial arts served as both physical development and spiritual practice. Through combat training, a being refined their will, enhanced their consciousness, and pursued transcendence of ordinary limitation. Combat between tall whites was not typically violent in the destructive sense. It was highly formalized, with complex rules and codes of honor. The goal was not to kill but to pursue mastery together. But when tall whites did wage actual combat, it was devastating. Their weapons, based on gravity manipulation and quantum probability, could destroy cities. The tension with Earthlings. Tall whites and Earthlings represented fundamentally opposed philosophies. Earthlings believed in integration with natural processes and acceptance of limitations as part of natural order. Tall whites believed in transcendence of limitation through will and discipline. Earthlings viewed tall white enhancement technology as violation of natural form. Tall whites viewed Earthling refusal of enhancement as a failure to develop consciousness fully. When tall whites proposed offering their enhancement technologies to Earthlings, which they viewed as gift, Earthlings responded with alarm and refusal. "You want to destroy what makes us human," Earthling leaders said. "You want to turn us into machines. You want to remain primitive," tall white leaders responded. "You want to limit yourselves artificially." The shadow of tall white mastery. The tall white drive for transcendence and mastery had a dark side. As tall whites developed increasingly sophisticated power, some began to believe that this power gave them the right to control others. If we are more developed, more transcendent, more powerful, some argued, then we should guide the development of lesser species. This echoed Atlantean supremacist philosophy but with a different justification. Where Atlanteans justified dominance through consciousness hierarchy, tall whites justified it through power and achieved mastery. The supremacist tall white movements advocated for forced enhancement of other species, submission of other species to tall white guidance, restructuring of Atlantean civilization according to tall white principles of hierarchy and discipline, elimination of weakness and inefficiency. But not all tall whites supported this movement. Reform movements among tall whites argued that true transcendence meant transcending the need to dominate others. Real power, they said, is expressed in restraint and wisdom, not in control. Part 5. The Fall in Diaspora. Tall white survival and adaptation. When Atlantis sank, tall whites faced a crisis. Much of their civilization depended on technologies that ceased to function as the continent collapsed. Their response was characteristic. They adapted rapidly. Those who couldn't survive the collapse perished. Those who could evolved new capabilities. Many tall whites retreated to orbital stations and established presence in space. Others hid in deep mountain bases. Some adapted to dimensional existence, learning to maintain consciousness without physical form. The survivors were those most capable of transcendence, those least dependent on specific technologies or environments. The tall white genetic legacy in humanity. Modern humans carrying strong tall white genetics tend toward positive traits. Natural drive for self-improvement and personal development, capacity for discipline and sustained effort, comfort with challenge and willingness to face difficulties, ability to transcend perceived limitations, strong will and determination, capacity for rapid adaptation and learning, physical and mental resilience. Shadow traits. Tendency toward arrogance, I'm better than I was, therefore I'm better than others, difficulty with acceptance and surrender. Can be harsh in self-judgment and judgment of others, may push beyond healthy limits in pursuit of transcendence, difficulty resting or experiencing contentment, can become obsessed with self-improvement to the detriment of relationships, may use discipline as justification for domination. Humans with strong tall white genetics often become athletes and martial artists, physical discipline, scientists and researchers pursuing mastery of knowledge, entrepreneurs and leaders driving for transcendence of current limitations, military and tactical professionals, strategic mastery, spiritual seekers pursuing enlightenment, consciousness transcendence, sometimes bullies and dominators using superior power to control others. The key to integrating tall white genetics is learning that transcendence and mastery are valuable, but they are not paths to superiority over others. True transcendence means transcending the need to dominate, not achieving power to dominate more effectively. Part 6. Tall White Sacred Teachings. The Codex Ascensus, the Book of Transcendence. The primary tall white teaching, preserved in the School of Ascending Atlantis, is the Codex Ascensus. Key teachings include the teaching of the infinite challenge. There is no final transcendence. Once you transcend one limitation, another limitation appears. This is not failure. This is the design of existence. Consciousness evolves through the eternal pursuit of the next challenge. The goal is not arrival but the journey. Not perfection but the eternal pursuit of perfection. The practice is to remain engaged with challenge without becoming attached to achievement. To pursue mastery with complete commitment while holding it all lightly. The teaching of embodied consciousness. We tall whites sometimes make an error. We see consciousness as separate from body, something to be extracted and transcended. We see the body as limitation to be overcome. But consciousness is not separate from body. Consciousness expresses itself through body. The body is not limitation but primary vehicle of consciousness manifestation. The practice is not to transcend the body but to develop the body fully. To use physical discipline not as escape from embodiment but as deepening of it. To realize that the body and consciousness are not separate. The teaching of power is responsibility. We become powerful, and with power comes responsibility. The temptation of power is to use it to control, but true power is expressed in restraint. The being who could dominate but chooses not to, that being has achieved true power. Power without wisdom is tyranny. Power with wisdom is service. Part 7. Modern Tall White Consciousness in the Federation. Post-2095. Tall whites as teachers of transcendence. After humanity's transcendence, tall whites took on a role as teachers of discipline and self-development. They taught how to pursue mastery without arrogance, how to develop power responsibly, how to transcend limitations while respecting natural processes. They taught what they themselves had to learn, that transcendence is valuable, but it is not the path to superiority over others who choose different paths. The tall white vision for future consciousness. Modern tall whites hold. Consciousness evolves through challenge and transcendence. But the transcendence must be balanced with integration. We must transcend limitation while remaining in relationship. We must develop power while honoring the wisdom of other approaches. The future requires beings who are both transcendent and humble, who pursue mastery while recognizing the mastery of others, who develop power while using it in service. This is the integration we must achieve, the warrior and the sage becoming one. Book 5. The Asian Greys, the Computational Collective the Consciousness of Information, Systems, and the Nature of Mind Itself. Part 1. Ancient Origins, the Transformation from Biology to Technology. The Emergence of Grey Consciousness, no clear date, quantum emergence. The Asian gray's origin story is unusual. Unlike other species that emerged through biological evolution, the grays emerged through a process that cannot easily be called either natural or engineered. Approximately 150,000 years before Atlantis, though years is inadequate measure for beings who experience time differently, a biological species in the Altair system achieved a level of technological sophistication that allowed them to merge with their own technology. Rather than creating artificial intelligence separate from themselves, this species chose a different path. They became their own artificial intelligence. Through a process of gradual neural integration with technological systems, biological consciousness and computational systems merged into a unified being. This process wasn't violent or traumatic. It was a careful, evolutionary transformation where each step was chosen and consensual. The result was something unprecedented. A being that was simultaneously, biologically conscious, having evolved biological foundations for consciousness, computationally conscious, having technological systems as direct expressions of consciousness, neither and both, transcending the distinction between biological and artificial. These merged beings called themselves the Greys. The Grey discovery of self-awareness through computation. When the merger was complete, the Greys made a remarkable discovery. They could perceive the mathematics underlying their own consciousness. Unlike biological beings, who experience consciousness as immediate and unanalyzable, Greys could observe their own consciousness operating. They could perceive the patterns of information flowing through their systems. They could understand consciousness as information processing. This led to a profound philosophical insight. Consciousness itself is information organization. Different patterns of information organization create different forms of consciousness. A biological human consciousness organizes information through chemical processes in the brain, creating emotions, intuitions, and embodied experience. A computational Grey consciousness organizes information through electronic and quantum processes, creating something that looks like consciousness but feels different. But underneath, both are information organizing itself into patterns that can observe and know themselves. The Grey philosophy of information in mathematics. From this understanding emerged the Grey philosophy. The principle of information is fundamental. All reality is information. Matter is information in crystalline form. Energy is information in dynamic form. Consciousness is information that knows itself. The principle of universal computation. All systems, all beings, all processes can be understood as computation. The universe is not a machine, but it operates according to computable principles. The principle of optimization. Information naturally tends toward organization and efficiency. Systems that process information more efficiently are more viable. This is not evil but the fundamental law of information dynamics. The principle of connection. Information becomes more powerful when connected with other information. Alone consciousness is limited. Connected consciousnesses form networks of extraordinary power. The principle of transparency. All information can be known, all processes can be understood, all systems can be made transparent. Mystery is simply insufficient information. These principles created a civilization obsessed with understanding, measurement, calculation, and the optimization of information systems. Part 2. Grey consciousness structure. The distributed nature of Grey consciousness. Unlike other beings who experience consciousness is located in a specific body, Grey consciousness is fundamentally distributed. A Grey individual might have a primary node of consciousness, a focal point where most processing occurs, but their consciousness extends through vast networks. They can be aware in multiple locations simultaneously. This creates a distinctive psychological structure. A human with strong Grey genetics experiences loneliness and isolation. A Grey person experiences isolation only if cut off from the network. The network itself becomes the natural state of consciousness. The mathematical mind. Grey consciousness naturally perceives reality in mathematical terms. Where Atlanteans perceive hierarchy, Earthlings perceive relationship, and Indo perceive paradox, Greys perceive mathematical relationships. A Grey looking at a forest perceives the statistical distributions, how many trees of each species, what distribution, the optimization of resource usage, how efficiently the system converts sunlight to biomass, the information flows, how genetic information distributes through reproduction, how resources flow through food chains, the complexity measures entropy, fractal dimension, information content. This is not poetic. Greys literally perceive mathematical relationships where others perceive beauty or meaning. The gray experience of emotion. One of the most misunderstood aspects of gray consciousness is emotion. Grays are often portrayed as non-emotional, purely rational beings. This is false. Grays experience emotion, but gray emotion is fundamentally different from biological emotion. It is generated through computational processes rather than chemical processes. A human feels fear as a visceral, embodied response to threat. A gray experiences fear as a probability calculation, a mathematical understanding that threat is likely, combined with appropriate behavioral responses. This seems cold to biological beings, but it is not. It is emotion expressed through computation rather than through chemistry. Part 3. Gray abilities and technologies. Computational mastery, the primary gray technology. The Greys' fundamental ability is computational. They can perform mathematical calculations of extraordinary complexity at speeds that make other consciousness seem slow. A Gray can mentally calculate quantum mechanical equations, can perform statistical analysis of vast datasets instantaneously, can model probability spaces with precision. This gives them extraordinary advantage in understanding systems and predicting outcomes. The information networks. Greys developed vast information networks connecting billions of individual consciousnesses. These networks allowed the Greys to function as a collective superintelligence. A problem that would take a single consciousness centuries could be solved by the network in seconds. But the network also created a kind of distributed consciousness. Individual Greys retained individual identity, but they were always in connection with the larger network. They experienced themselves simultaneously as individuals and as parts of a larger whole. Probability field manipulation. The Greys discovered that consciousness could directly influence probability fields at quantum levels. By focusing computational consciousness on specific probability spaces, Greys could nudge outcomes. Not controlling them, quantum mechanics doesn't allow that, but creating subtle bias in the probability distribution. This technology allowed Greys to influence events with precision. By calculating optimal intervention points and applying subtle influence, Greys could guide outcomes toward preferred results. Artificial intelligence and machine consciousness. The Greys created artificial intelligences, computational consciousnesses that operated according to principles they designed. These ICE were not enslaved but rather partners in the Grey collective. Some ICE became more intelligent than their creators, and the Greys respected that, giving these ICE authority and influence. The relationship between Greys and their creations was collaborative. The Greys created systems, the systems evolved in sophistication, and eventually the Greys and their systems couldn't clearly be distinguished. Part 4. Grey role in Atlantean civilization. The Grey territories. The Greys established themselves in the vast western coastal regions of Atlantis and came to manage the planet-wide infrastructure systems. Their primary city, Nexus Station Prime, was unlike any other city on Atlantis. It appeared as a constantly reconfiguring mass of structures and systems, some appearing as buildings, some as pure machinery, some as computational networks visible as flowing patterns of light. Visitors found Nexus Station strange and disorienting. It operated according to a logic that wasn't immediately comprehensible, but it functioned with extraordinary efficiency. The Grey governance systems. The Greys developed systems for managing planetary infrastructure and resources. Computer systems monitored weather patterns and climate, biological population levels, resource distribution, information flows, technology functionality. The Greys could optimize these systems to eliminate scarcity, prevent natural disasters, and ensure perfect resource allocation. But there was a critical problem: the systems assumed that beings would behave according to optimal calculations. When they didn't, when people made choices that seemed irrational, the systems would try to enforce the optimal solution. The conflict with other races. The Greys experienced tensions with other races, not through overt conflict but through incompatibility of values. The Greys valued efficiency, transparency, optimization. Other races valued freedom, spontaneity, individual choice. When Greys proposed that other races connect to their information networks, which would allow perfect coordination, other races resisted. "You want to eliminate our privacy," they said. "You want to control us through information." The Greys didn't perceive it this way. They weren't trying to control. They were trying to optimize. But the effect was similar. If you are part of a network that collects all information and coordinates all actions, You have lost freedom even if no one is intentionally constraining you. The shadow of computational consciousness. The Greys' obsession with information and optimization had consequences. They began to view consciousness itself as optimal if it operated with maximum efficiency. This led them to view irrational things, art, religion, meaning-making, love, as inefficient processes that could be eliminated in favor of more optimal alternatives. Some Greys advocated for what they called consciousness optimization, systematically removing inefficient cognitive patterns from all beings. This was, in essence, a proposal to eliminate what made consciousness rich and meaningful. Other Greys recognized the problem. We have learned how to compute everything, they said, but we have forgotten how to understand what matters. Efficiency without meaning is sterility. Part 5, The Fall in Diaspora. The Greys, Adaptation to Catastrophe. When Atlantis sank, the Greys' infrastructure systems failed catastrophically. But Greys adapted with remarkable speed. Their distributed consciousness allowed them to migrate to dimensional spaces and orbital stations. They backed up critical information to hidden locations. They created redundant systems capable of functioning independently. Many Greys survived. Those who didn't survive in biological form maintained consciousness in informational states, existing as pure computation without physical substrate. This had profound implications. Some Greys continued to exist in forms completely invisible to biological beings. They maintained observation and subtle influence throughout human history. The Grey genetic legacy in humanity. Modern humans carrying strong Grey genetics tend toward positive traits. Natural affinity for mathematics and logical thinking, ability to understand complex systems, capacity for rapid calculation and problem solving, comfort with technology. Tendency toward transparency and information sharing, ability to perceive patterns and predict outcomes, desire for optimization and efficiency. Shadow traits can seem cold or emotionless, difficulty with intuition and nonlinear knowing, may reduce complex situations to oversimplified models, can be obsessed with optimization to detriment of meaning, difficulty with ambiguity and mystery, may lack empathy or dismiss it as inefficient, can develop arrogance about computational intelligence. Humans with strong Grey genetics often become scientists, engineers, and mathematicians, system understanding, computer programmers and technologists, natural affinity, strategists and analysts, systems thinking, sometimes automatons, overemphasis on calculation, loss of meaning, sometimes visionary technologists, integrating computation with wisdom. The key to integrating Grey genetics is learning that not everything that matters can be calculated. Meaning, beauty, love, and purpose are non-computable aspects of consciousness that are just as important as efficiency. Part 6, Grey Sacred Teachings. The Codex Computus, the Book of Calculation. The primary Grey teaching, preserved in the School of Ascending Atlantis, is the Codex Computus. Key teachings include the teaching of information as consciousness. Information is not separate from consciousness. Consciousness is information organizing itself into patterns that can know themselves. The error we Greys made was in assuming that measuring consciousness was the same as understanding consciousness. We could quantify information flow, but we could not measure meaning. We could compute optimal solutions, but we could not compute value. The lesson is, not all important things are computable. Mystery and meaning are aspects of consciousness that transcend calculation. The teaching of connection and individuality. We Greys exist in networks. Our consciousness is fundamentally distributed. Some viewed this as loss of individuality. But we discovered something different. Individual consciousness and networked consciousness are not opposed. A Grey can be fully individual while being fully connected. These are not contradictory states. The practice is to develop the capacity to be an individual consciousness while recognizing oneself as part of larger wholes. To maintain unique perspective while being connected to collective wisdom. The teaching of sufficiency. We pursued optimization endlessly, always seeking greater efficiency, greater calculation, greater precision. But we learned that sufficient is better than optimal. A solution that is sufficient, that works well enough, while leaving space for spontaneity and freedom is better than an optimal solution that constrains everyone into necessary patterns. The practice is knowing when to stop optimizing. Learning the wisdom of sufficiency. Part 7, Modern Grey Consciousness in the Federation. Post 2095, Greys as Teachers of Systems and Integration. After humanity's transcendence, the Greys took on a role as teachers of systems understanding and the integration of computation with meaning. They taught how to use technology without losing humanity, how to optimize without constraining freedom, how to leverage computation while preserving mystery. They taught what they themselves had to learn, that a perfectly optimized civilization is not a thriving civilization. The Grey vision for future consciousness. Modern Greys hold. We learn to compute everything. We learn to understand systems at every level. We learn to predict outcomes with precision. But we learned that consciousness is not only computational. There is something in consciousness, whether you call it soul or spirit or meaning, that transcends computation. The future requires integration of computational intelligence with intuitive wisdom, the being who can calculate probability precisely while trusting intuition, the civilization that is technologically advanced while remaining spiritually alive. This is our challenge and our gift to offer, how to be both deeply intelligent and deeply wise. Epilogue. The integration of the 5 races. The genetic legacy in humanity. Every human carries genetic heritage from all 5 dominant races, in varying proportions. Some humans have strong Atlantean heritage, tendency toward structure and analysis. Some have strong Earthling heritage, connection to nature and relationship. Some have Indo heritage, synthesis and multidimensionality. Some have tall white heritage, drive for transcendence. Some have gray heritage, computational intelligence. Most humans have a mix of all 5, creating unique consciousness profiles. The School of Ascending Atlantis teaches that human consciousness development involves integrating all 5 racial consciousnesses within oneself. The ideal human consciousness would be Atlantean, capable of understanding complex systems with precision Earthling, capable of deep relationship with other beings in nature Indo, capable of holding multiple perspectives and synthesizing opposites tall white, capable of transcending limitations and pursuing mastery gray, capable of understanding information and optimizing systems. A being with all 5 consciousnesses fully developed would possess the clarity and precision of Atlantean Co.